The Conrad Mills grain elevator sat at the edge of the county road like it had always sat there and always would, a thing as permanent as the tree line to the east and the water tower to the north. It was a Tuesday morning in the last week of September 1998, and the light was the kind of flat gray light that comes to western Missouri when the season is turning, when the fields are open and the air smells of cut stems and turned earth, and the particular dryness that follows a harvest. Earl Hutchins had been standing at the window of his feed store since 7 that morning. This was not unusual. Earl had stood at that window for 30 years watching the intersection of routes B and 7, the way a man watches something he has come to understand completely, not because it was always interesting, but because it was always true. He knew the rhythm of every truck, every farmer, every load. He knew who ran early in the season and who waited. He knew whose equipment broke down in the second week and whose held together through the last field. He knew the sound of a Peterbilt with a full grain bed before it came around the curve, and he knew the difference between a truck that had done its business and a truck that had not. The Peterbilt came in at 8 that morning, loaded, moving with the heavy deliberateness of a truck carrying 12,000 bushels of soybeans. Earl watched it turn into the elevator lot and disappear behind the scale house. He went back to his invoices. At 9:15, he looked up and saw the same truck pulling out of the elevator lot and turning back down the county road. The grain bed was still full. Earl stood at the window for a long moment. A truck leaving the elevator with a full grain bed on a Tuesday morning in late September was not something you saw unless something had gone wrong. He knew whose beans were in that truck. He had known Margaret Calloway since she was 12 years old, since the days she used to come into his store with her father Lyle to buy hog feed, standing straight and quiet beside the man while he settled accounts, watching everything. Earl sat down. He did not pick up the phone yet. He thought about what he had seen and what it meant, and he thought about Meg Calloway, and he thought about Lyle, who had been dead 3 years now. Then he went back to his invoices and waited until afternoon. Across the county road in the small office at the front of the Conrad Mills facility, Don Reardon was standing at his own window. He was 54 years old and had managed this elevator for 22 years. He had stood at this window and watched trucks come and go 10,000 times. He knew the rhythm, too, the same way Earl knew it, except that Don's rhythm was about weight and moisture and grade and the daily movement of commodity prices on the board. He was holding the probe sample result in his right hand. 12% cracked soybeans. The Conrad Mills policy was 10% maximum. The number was not ambiguous, and the policy was not flexible because the policy existed for a reason. Blending lots with high crack percentages drove down the grade of the entire blend and created a cleaning cost that landed on the elevator's margin. Don had not invented the policy. He had inherited it, and he had enforced it consistently for 22 years, and he had been right to do so. He had offered Margaret Calloway 45 cents per bushel below the board price to account for the dockage. He had made the offer the way he made every offer, without apology and without pressure, because it was the fair commercial offer under the circumstances. 45 cents on 12,000 bushels was $5,400 out of her revenue. He knew she was doing that math while he was talking. He watched her do it. She didn't reach for a calculator. She didn't ask him to repeat the number. She just stood beside the truck for about 45 seconds, looking at nothing in particular, and then she thanked him for his time and told the driver to take the load back. She thanked him the way a person thanks someone when the transaction is genuinely complete, not the way a person thanks someone when they are angry and hiding it. Don had seen both versions many times. This was the first kind. That was what made him stand at the window longer than he needed to, watching the Peterbilt turn onto the county road, the grain bed riding high and full against the gray September sky. He had simply been talking to a commodity grower, he told himself. That was the business he was in. He went back to his desk and processed the next load, and he did not think about that Tuesday morning again for a long time. On the county road, sitting in the passenger seat of the Peterbilt as it rolled back toward the Callaway farm, Meg said nothing. The driver, a hired man who worked for Linda Bosworth on the neighboring property, glanced over at her once. He was a practical man who had driven grain trucks for 15 years, and he understood what a full load coming back from the elevator meant in operational terms. He understood it meant money lost or at least deferred. He felt he should say something useful. I could go back and try to negotiate, he said. Sometimes Reardon moves a little if you push him right. Meg looked at the road ahead. Take me home, she said. Same voice she had used to tell him to leave the elevator. Not sharp, not defeated, just the voice of a woman who had already moved on to the next question. The driver didn't say anything else. He drove. Meg was 36 years old that September. She had grown up on the 200-acre Callaway farm, the older of two children, and had worked it from the time she was old enough to be useful without being a liability. Her parents, Lyle and Eleanor Callaway, had farmed it in soybeans and corn, with a small hog operation that Eleanor managed with the same methodical care she applied to everything she did, which was considerable care. Meg had left for the University of Missouri in 1981 and had come back with a degree in food science 4 years later. She had spent the following 8 years in Kansas City working for a mid-sized food manufacturer that produced packaged snack foods and grain-based products sold to grocery chains throughout the Midwest. She had started in quality control and moved into product development, where she learned in the particular way that you only learn things when you are responsible for them professionally, how a food product moved from raw agricultural material to retail shelf, and what happened to its value at every step of that journey. She had left Kansas City in 1993 when Lyle's health declined. She had intended to stay a year, maybe two, to help with the farm transition and be present while her father was still present. She had stayed because something about the combination of what she knew from food science and what the farm represented had turned out to be more interesting to her than anything she had been doing in an industrial kitchen. Her brother Tom, 4 years younger and living in St. Louis, where he worked as a structural engineer, had come back that first autumn to help sort through the farm's finances. He was a decent man who loved his sister and had no particular feel for the land. He sat across from Meg at the kitchen table one evening, looking at the numbers, and said what seemed to him like the reasonable thing. You don't have to sacrifice your career for this. We could hire someone to manage the property, maybe sell the North 40 if we need to simplify. Meg looked at him for a moment. Then she looked out the window toward the barn and the fields beyond it, the 80 acres of soybeans still standing in the late October light. Nobody is selling any part of this land, she said. The sentence had no heat in it. It was simply a fact she was communicating the way you tell someone the temperature outside. Tom understood that the conversation was over. He went back to St. Louis the following day and did not raise the subject again. What Tom did not understand and what Meg had not yet fully articulated even to herself was what the farm represented to her that it didn't represent to him. He saw it as a responsibility, an inherited obligation with real carrying costs and uncertain returns. She saw it as something else, something she had been trying to name since the first year she came back. She had not quite found the name for it yet in the autumn of 1993. She would be closer to it by the autumn of 1998. Lyle Callaway died in March of 1995, 2 years after Meg came home. He was not a man who expressed himself in long speeches. In the last week, when it was clear the week would be the last, he said to Meg one evening while she was sitting beside his bed, "You know what's worth something on this land? Don't let somebody else put a price on it." She thought he was talking about the farm itself, the ground, the machinery, the accumulated equity of 40 years of careful work. It took her a long time to understand he was talking about something larger than that. She wrote the sentence on a small piece of paper and tucked it into the cover of the farm's accounting ledger where it stayed. The summer of 1996, on a Saturday when she had driven up to Kansas City for a soil amendment she couldn't get locally, Meg stopped at a natural food grocery store in the Westport neighborhood. She was not there for anything specific. It was a habit from her Kansas City years, the kind of store she used to browse on weekends when she was thinking about product development, looking at how other people were solving the problem of getting agricultural value to a consumer who would pay for it. She picked up a 12-ounce stand-up bag of dry roasted soybeans from a shelf in the bulk snack section. The retail price was $3.29. She turned the bag over, looked at the weight, looked at the price. In her head, automatically, the way a person who has spent 8 years in product development does, automatically she began disaggregating the number. Soybeans were trading around $4.60 a bushel that summer. A bushel weighed 60 pounds. That worked out to roughly 7.5 cents per pound at commodity price. The bag in her hand was 12 ounces, 3/4 of a pound. Raw material cost at commodity price a little under 6 cents. Retail price of the finished bag, $3.29. Someone was capturing the difference between 6 cents and $3.29. Someone had cleaned the beans, roasted them, seasoned them, packaged them, labeled them, distributed them, and placed them on this shelf. That chain of steps existed, and the value it created was real, and the person who grew the soybeans was receiving 6 cents of the $3.29. She placed the bag in her cart and bought it. She drove back to Cass County. That evening, she ate some of the beans at the kitchen table and thought about what she had tasted. They were good, not extraordinary, not the product of some secret or specialized knowledge that she could not access. They were clean soybeans that had been roasted well with honest seasoning, and someone was selling them at retail for 32 times the commodity price of the underlying ingredient. She did not do anything with that calculation for 2 years. Sometimes you have to wait for circumstances to make the obvious thing obvious. The circumstance arrived on a Tuesday morning in late September of 1998 when Don Reardon handed her a probe sample result showing 12% cracked soybeans in a load she had brought in from 80 acres that had yielded 38 bushels per acre, a solid yield for that part of the county. The cracked percentage was higher than it should have been because she had run the combine cylinder speed slightly fast during one long day of harvest and had not caught the problem until the damage was done. It was a fixable mistake, the kind that teaches you something once and never again. But it had produced a load that Conrad Mills could not accept at full price. Don Reardon had not been wrong. He had made the correct call under the correct policy for a commodity elevator, managing blended lots. He had offered her the commercially reasonable alternative. She had done the math in 45 seconds and understood that taking the discount meant giving $5,400 to an organization that was going to extract considerably more value from her grain before it left the county. That was the structure of the business she was in, and she had understood that structure for 2 years, standing in a grocery store in Westport, holding a bag that cost $3.29. She thanked Don Reardon and went home. That evening, after she had made a call to a cleaning facility in Pleasant Hill to arrange for the cracked material to be removed from the load, and after she had calculated that the process would cost 8 cents a bushel and leave her with approximately 10,600 bushels of clean whole beans, she sat at the kitchen table with 3 pieces of paper. The first sheet had the numbers. Cleaning cost remaining bushels market value if she sold everything at board price net position. She ran the figures twice to make sure they said what she thought they said. The second sheet had a different set of numbers, the ones she had been accumulating in her head for 2 years, the retail price of processed specialty soybeans against the commodity price of whole soybeans, the differential that existed because of the steps between raw grain and finished product, and her own honest assessment of whether she had the knowledge and the capacity to execute those steps. The third sheet was blank for a long time. She looked at it across the kitchen table in the quiet of the farmhouse, the kind of quiet that settles in when you are the only person in a house that was built for more than one. Then she picked up a pen and wrote 5 things one beneath the other: clean, keep, process, package, sell, direct. 5 steps, simple enough to look naive. She had spent 8 years learning in operational detail what each of those steps actually required. She knew it was not naive. She also knew she was committing to something by writing it down, the same way you commit to a direction when you put the first stake in the ground. She opened the farm's accounting ledger to check something. The small piece of paper with her father's words was still tucked inside the cover. She read it once. Then she closed the ledger, turned off the kitchen light, and went to bed. At 4 o'clock the following afternoon, Earl Hutchins called her. He had waited until he thought she would have had time to think. "I saw the truck come back this morning," he said. "What happened?" She told him. Crack percentage, the policy, the offered discount, her decision to take the load home. "That's a shame," Earl said. He meant it without sentiment. It was a commercial setback, and he recognized it as one. "I have some ideas," Meg said. "I'd like to hear them when you've got them worked out." "I'll call you," she said. And that was the end of the conversation. Earl had known Meg Calloway for more than 30 years, since she was a girl standing beside Lyle in his store, and he had watched her grow into a woman who operated a 200-acre farm without a partner and without complaint, who understood equipment and soil and weather and markets, who had come back from 8 years in Kansas City food manufacturing, with a kind of quiet knowledge about how value moved through systems. When she said she had ideas, Earl did not hear the phrase the way you hear it from someone who is trying to feel better about a setback. He heard it from someone who had already solved the problem and was deciding how much to say. He did not tell her that. He said it was a shame and that he would like to hear her ideas. That was what the situation called for. Linda Bosworth came by later that same afternoon. She farmed the adjacent property, 160 acres. She had been working alone since her husband died 8 years earlier. She was 58 and had been farming for 35 years and was one of the most practically competent people in Cass County, the kind of competence that has no patience for anything except results. She had lent Meg the use of her hired man and the Peterbilt for the haul to the elevator, which meant she had a natural interest in how the day had gone. She drove into the yard and saw the grain bin still sitting full. She got out and walked over to where Meg was standing near the barn. "Reardon turned you away," Linda said. 12% cracked. Their limit is 10. Linda shook her head, not with sympathy, but with the precise expression of a skilled person recognizing a technical error. "Cylinder speed," she said. "I told you last fall." "You were right," Meg said. "I'll correct it next season. What are you going to do with this load?" "I'm working on that." Linda looked at her for a moment. She had known Meg long enough to know that "I'm working on that" from Meg Calloway was not a deflection. It meant the work was already done, and she wasn't ready to describe it yet. Linda didn't push. She picked up the keys she had come to retrieve and went back to her truck. What Linda could not have known, standing in that yard looking at a full grain bin on a Tuesday afternoon, was that she would be among the first people in Cass County to buy a bag of Callaway Ridge roasted soybeans when they appeared on the specialty food shelf at the Peculiar Grocery 2 years later. She would not buy it as a gesture of support. She would buy it because she saw Cass County, Missouri on the label, and she wanted to know whether the product was worth the price. It was. She bought more. She never mentioned this to Meg. By the end of that week, Meg had arranged for the full load to go to the cleaning facility in Pleasant Hill. The cracked material came out for 8 cents a bushel, leaving her with 10,600 bushels of clean whole beans. She sold 5,300 bushels through a different elevator at board price and moved the money into the farm's operating account. She kept the other 5,300 bushels in the bin nearest the east end of the barn, the end she had already begun to think about differently. The 5,300 bushels sat there through October, through November, into December. They were not going to Conrad Mills. They were not going anywhere at commodity price. They were waiting for what Meg was going to build, and she was building it as fast as a person builds something alone with limited capital, and a plan that exists so far only on 3 pieces of paper and in the accumulated knowledge of a food science degree and 8 years of manufacturing experience. 5,300 bushels of clean whole Missouri soybeans sitting in a bin on a 200-acre farm in Cass County, while the woman who grew them converted the east half of the barn into something that had never existed on this property before, and decided in the quiet way she decided most things that the value in what she had grown was not going to walk out of this county on somebody else's truck. That was where the story was in those months. Not in the drama of the elevator, though that morning would matter forever. Not in the $5,400 she had declined to give away, though that number would be told and retold as the origin of what came after. The story was in the 5,300 bushels sitting in the dark of a grain bin in late autumn, and in the woman working in the barn on the other side of the wall, and in the 5 words she had written on a piece of paper at the kitchen table, and the 1 sentence her father had spoken in the last week of his life that she was finally beginning to understand completely. Don't let somebody else put a price on it. She had thought he meant the land. He had meant everything she could make from it. The equipment auction in St. Joseph was held on the 2nd Saturday of December, in a warehouse on the south side of the city, where the Missouri River smell came in through the loading dock doors and mixed with the machine oil in the cold. There were 40, maybe 50 people moving through the rows of equipment that morning, men, mostly wearing the kind of coats that spend more time on tractor seats than on coat racks. Meg arrived early. She had a printed list of 3 items she wanted to inspect before the bidding started, and she moved through the warehouse the way she moved through most situations, without announcing herself and without wasting time. The rotary drum roaster was in the 3rd row toward the back. It was a commercial-grade unit, steel construction. 8-foot drum, the kind of equipment that had been built to run production batches continuously, and had done exactly that for years before the nut processing operation that owned it went under. It was not new. The exterior showed the honest wear of a machine that had been used seriously. But the wells were solid and the drive mechanism moved without grinding when Meg manually rotated the drum, and the burner assembly was intact. Standing beside her was Walt Greer. Dale, her cousin, had brought him. Walt was 67 years old and had farmed his own ground in Cass County for 4 decades before selling the operation to his son 2 years earlier. He had run grain drying equipment for 20 years and knew the mechanics of heat and rotation the way some men know the feel of soil between their fingers. Dale had called him the night before and asked if he would come look at a machine his cousin was thinking about buying, and Walt had said yes, the way men of his generation said yes to that kind of request without needing a full explanation, because Dale had never asked him for anything he did not have a reason to ask for. Walt walked around the roaster once without speaking. He pressed on the drum casing at 3 different points. He crouched and looked at the underside of the drive shaft. He stood and looked at the burner assembly for a long moment, then put his hand near the yeast fitting, and checked the connection without touching it directly. Then he straightened up and said, "Rear bearing needs attention, but the machine is sound. Under 4,000 is reasonable." That was the full extent of his assessment. Meg had learned enough about men like Walt Greer to know that he would not have used the word sound if he had any real doubt. The bidding started. There was one other serious bidder, a heavy-set man in his 50s, who had been circling the roaster before Meg arrived, and who carried himself with the ease of someone accustomed to winning at auctions. He bid with the deliberate confidence of a man who expected the other party to quit. Meg bid without expression. The number moved up. The man stopped at 3,300. Meg said 3,400. The auctioneer called it. The man looked at her for a moment, then moved on to the next lot. On the drive back, Walt sat in the passenger seat and watched the winter fields pass. After a while, he said, "You know how to run a drum roaster." "I know the principles," Meg said. "I'll learn the machine." Walt was quiet for another mile. Then, "I might be able to help with that." Meg glanced over. "Are you looking for work?" "I'm looking for something to do in the mornings," he said. "My son doesn't need me in his fields, and my wife says I'm underfoot." It was the longest personal statement Meg had ever heard Walt Greer make. She took it for what it was. "I'll need someone by January," she said. "Morning hours, machine operation, and maintenance. I can pay by the hour." "What are we making?" Walt asked. "Roasted soybeans, dry roasted seasoned, packaged for retail." Walt nodded once slowly, the way a man nods when the answer is stranger than he expected, but not unreasonable. He looked back out the window at the passing fields and didn't say anything else until they reached the county line. That evening, Walt told his wife he had seen something interesting. She asked him what. He thought about it for a moment and said he wasn't sure yet, but he wanted to see where it went. Dale spent 2 days in the barn in mid-December, wiring the 3-phase panel for the roaster. He was a licensed electrician who charged real rates to real customers and family rates to family, and the family rate in this case was $180 for the panel work and the time plus coffee. While he was working, he asked Meg the question that needed asking, the one that a practical man asks when he is being asked to invest his labor in something. "You're putting $3,400 into a machine to make roasted soybeans. Who are you selling them to?" Meg explained, "Not the full version, not the Westport grocery store and the 2-year calculation and the 5 steps on the paper. Just enough. The natural food market, the retail price differential. The fact that she had the raw material on the property, the processing knowledge from Kansas City, and now the equipment." Dale listened without interrupting, which was how he listened when he was taking something seriously. When she finished, he said, "All right, I still need the coffee." He finished the panel on the 3rd day. The roaster was bolted down, wired, and ready. Meg stood in the east half of the barn, which she had spent 3 weeks clearing and cleaning and framing out as a dedicated processing space, and looked at the machine that was going to determine whether the 5,300 bushels in the bin outside were worth considerably more than board price, or were in the end just soybeans. She started testing the first week of January. The first 6 batches taught her that what she knew from food science and what a drum roaster actually did in practice were related but not identical. In a controlled production environment with calibrated equipment and consistent feedstock, you could apply principles reliably. In the east half of a converted barn in Cass County in January, with a used roaster that had its own mechanical history and soybeans drawn from bins where the temperature had been dropping for 2 months, the variables were more numerous and less cooperative. The drum's speed affected the residence time, which affected the color, which affected the flavor, which was affected by the moisture content of the incoming beans, which was not the same from bin to bin, and was not even the same from morning to afternoon in the same bin as the ambient temperature in the barn changed. She kept a log for every batch. Input moisture drum speed temperature at the burner time in the drum, output color on a simple scale she defined for herself, taste score on 5 points. After 6 batches, she had data, and she had problems, and she had a clearer understanding of which variables were controllable and which ones she needed to account for before they became problems. Walt arrived the second week of January without a formal start date, having been set simply driving into the yard at 7 in the morning on a Monday and walking into the barn. Meg was already there. He looked at the batch log from the previous week, asked 2 questions about the drum speed settings she had been using, and then stood beside the machine for the next 2 hours observing without touching anything. At the end of that time, he said, "Try adding 8 RPM to the drum speed and dropping your burner temp by 15 degrees. You'll get more even color without losing internal moisture." Meg adjusted the settings. She ran a batch 11 with those parameters. The output was noticeably better than anything she had produced in the first 10 batches. She did not say much about that. She wrote the parameters in the log, noted the output quality, and set up the next batch. Walt seemed to understand that this was the appropriate response. The evening of batch 7 had been the low point, though it had not felt like a crisis at the time. It had felt like the honest assessment of a situation that was harder than she had estimated. The bin from the north section of the barn had higher moisture than the other bins because the north wall was less insulated and the temperature differential over a cold night had been enough to affect the grain. 1/3 of the batch came out dark at the edges. The rest came out underdeveloped. 80 pounds of soybeans that were not what they needed to be. Meg stood in the barn at 11 o'clock at night and looked at the output spread across the sorting table. She was 36 years old. She had a used roaster, 5,200 remaining bushels, and 7 batches of data that told her she had underestimated the complexity of what she was doing. The question she was sitting with was not whether to continue. She had not seriously considered stopping. The question was more specific and more uncomfortable, whether she had the technical depth to solve what she was encountering, or whether she had constructed an elaborate plan around knowledge that was less transferable than she had believed. She sat with that question for 10 minutes in the cold of the barn, listening to the machine cool and tick. Then she picked up the moisture meter from the workbench and went to every bin in the barn, measuring and recording in the dark so that when she came back the next morning, she would know exactly what she was feeding into the drum. Batch 8 was better. Batch 9 was better than 8. By batch 14, she had a process she could run consistently. By batch 23, she had a product she was willing to put her name on. The formula was not complicated. A light application of oil before the drum, a specific salt level she had arrived at through 4 batches of calibration, and the particular combination of temperature and residence time that the Cass County beans in Cass County winter air required. She believed, as a professional principle carried forward from her product development years, that a good ingredient well treated was worth more than a complicated formula applied to a mediocre one. The soybeans on this farm were good. She treated them accordingly. Walt was there for batch 23. When the output came off the sorting table, Meg took a handful and stood by the machine and ate them. Then she held out her hand to Walt. He took some. He chewed. He nodded once with the considered brevity of a man who does not perform reactions. "That's the one," Meg said. "That's the one," Walt agreed. The notebook she had used to log every batch with its handwritten entries and moisture readings and marginal notes would later become one of the most consequential documents she owned. When the non-GMO project certification process began and the inspector went through her production records, he would look at that notebook and say that her quality control documentation was better than what he saw at facilities 10 times her size. Meg would not explain that the notebook began as the record of someone who could not afford to repeat the same mistake twice and had decided that writing everything down was the only protection against doing so. Patty Drummond appeared at the barn door on a morning in early February, on a day when the temperature had dropped overnight, and the condensation on the metal roof was dripping in a steady, irregular line near the east wall. Meg heard the knock and looked up from the packaging table she was assembling from plywood and angle iron. Patty was 44 years old, recently divorced, and looking for work with enough flexibility to allow her to pick up her kids from school at 3 in the afternoon. She had heard about what Meg was building from Earl Hutchins, who had mentioned it in passing at the co-op without going into detail. She had driven over because she needed work and because the vagueness of Earl's description suggested something at an early stage, which meant the arrangement might be flexible in the way that established operations were not. Meg looked at her across the half-assembled packaging table. "I can pay by the hour and by the piece," she said. "I can't offer a fixed salary yet. The volume isn't there. Some weeks there'll be plenty of hours and some weeks there won't be much." "What's the hourly rate?" Patty asked. Meg told her. "I can start today if that works." It worked. Patty started that morning helping Meg finish assembling the packaging table and learning the sequence of the bagging operation over the following 2 days. She asked practical questions and did not ask questions that were not practical. By the end of the first week, she had a solid command of the process. 3 weeks later, Meg came in one morning and found the packaging station rearranged. The sequence of steps was different. The layout of materials had been changed. She stood and looked at it for a moment and then ran a test sequence and found that the new arrangement reduced unnecessary hand movements and produced a measurably faster cycle. She asked Patty about it. Patty looked at her steadily. "Better results. I thought that was what you wanted." "It is," Meg said. "But when you change something in this facility, I need to know before it changes. Not because I don't trust your judgment, because I need to know everything that's happening in here at all times." Patty held her gaze. "Understood," she said. No apology beyond what the situation required, no defensiveness, just the confirmation that the information had landed. It was the moment the working relationship between them became something real, rather than a transaction. Meg recognized it and moved on because there was work to do. The Missouri Department of Agriculture inspector came in March. His name was Dennis Wark, and he had been doing commercial food facility inspections for 11 years, which meant he had seen the operations ranging from well-capitalized and poorly run to improvised and meticulous, and he had learned to assess them on results rather than appearances. He walked through the east barn with a clipboard and a professional neutrality that gave nothing away. He found 2 items. The hand-washing sink in the processing area needed to be a specific commercial-grade fixture. The floor drain in the roasting area needed a grease trap addition to meet food facility standards. Both were structural corrections, not procedural ones. He wrote them on the form, then paused and said without looking up from the clipboard, "You're running this operation alone." "With 2 people," Meg said. "Part-time." He wrote something else. Then in a tone that was not unfriendly but was separate from the official record. "These facilities usually need at least 1 person whose primary job is sanitation compliance. Just an operational observation." Meg looked at him. "Is that in the regulation?" "No." "Then I'll address the 2 items on the form," she said. Wark nodded, made his final notes, and left. He was not wrong about the sanitation observation. He was describing a real operational reality. But Meg had spent 8 years in food manufacturing, watching companies hire people for compliance tasks that should have been built into the process itself, and she had decided early that the Callaway Ridge facility would be built so that sanitation was not a separate job, but an integrated condition of every step. She would carry more of that burden herself, at least until the operation could support the labor cost. That was the trade she had made. The sink and the drain were done in a single weekend. 14 hours of her own labor, $2,100 in materials. The commercial license came through in April. She had applied for a Missouri cottage food license in January as a bridge, and she had begun the non-GMO certification process in February, knowing it would take time and that the certification, when it came, would open accounts that were currently closed to her. She had removed the non-GMO claim from the first production labels rather than make a statement she could not yet certify. The label said what was true: Missouri grown, dry roasted, Callaway Ridge. The labels had been designed on a borrowed computer at the Harrisonville Library on 3 separate evenings in February. Meg was not a graphic designer, but she had spent 8 years evaluating food packaging and understood the visual language that natural food consumers responded to: clarity, restraint, and the suggestion of a specific place and a specific person behind the product. She wanted the label to look like it came from a farm because it did. The illustration of the soybean plant came from her niece Annie, Tom's daughter, who was 16 and in 10th grade and did not know she was designing a commercial logo. Meg had called her and asked if she could draw a soybean plant simple in ink clean lines. Annie had asked what it was for. Meg had said a product label. Annie had asked what product. Meg had said roasted soybeans. There had been a brief pause on the line, the particular pause of a teenager recalibrating her expectations of a phone call, and then Annie had said she would send something. The fax came 3 days later: a single branch with 3 leaves and 2 bean pods, the ink lines precise and unornamented. Meg looked at it for a long time. She made no changes. The drawing went to the label printer exactly as it had come off the fax machine, creased from transmission and slightly warm. That fax, the original, still sits in the top drawer of Meg's desk at the farm. It is not framed, it is not laminated. It is under a stack of old invoices, and it has been there since 1999, and it will likely be there long after the building around it has changed into whatever it becomes next. She loaded 2 cases of finished into her pickup truck in the 3rd week of March and drove to Kansas City. She had made 8 appointments over 2 weeks of phone calls with natural food stores and independent grocers that carried specialty food sections. She had typed a 1-page sell sheet herself, single-spaced, with the farm name, the processing method, the price structure, the case quantity, and her phone number at the bottom. She wore the clothes she wore to any farm business meeting, which were the clothes she wore on the farm because she was a farmer and she was selling something that came from a farm, and she was not going to perform otherwise. At the 4th appointment in a natural food store in the Westport neighborhood, she sat across from the buying manager, a man named Marcus Webb, who was 35 and had been purchasing for specialty food retailers for a decade. He turned the 12-ounce bag over in his hands, read the label, and looked up. Non-GMO claim, but no certification mark, he said. Certification is in process, Meg said. I removed the claim from the label until the certification is complete. The sourcing is verifiable. The beans are grown on my farm. Why should I take your word on that? Meg looked at him without any change in her expression. You shouldn't take my word. You should taste the product and decide if it's worth carrying while the certification completes. If it isn't, I'll come back when the mark is on the label. Webb opened a sample bag. He ate several beans slowly, the way a professional taster eats, without hurrying toward a conclusion. Then he said 4 cases. 4? It was the largest single order of the day. Marcus Webb would still be ordering Callaway Ridge product 8 years later through 3 store expansions and 2 ownership changes, and he would tell people who asked about the brand that he had made the decision in about 30 seconds of tasting, and that nothing that came after had given him any reason to revisit it. 5 of the 8 stores placed orders. The smallest was 2 cases. The largest was Marcus Webb's 4. She drove back to Cass County with committed orders totaling $840 and a clarity about what the next 12 months would require that she could not have manufactured for herself without having made those 8 phone calls and sat in those 8 rooms and watched 8 different people decide what the product was worth. The first year's revenue from Callaway Ridge roasted soybeans was $47,000. Against the commodity value of those same beans at board price on the day Don Reardon had handed back the probe sample, that number was nearly double. She had not left the county to do it. She had not raised capital. She had spent $3,400 on a roaster, $180 on electrical work, $2,100 on a facility correction, and 8 hours of her own time building a sorting table from plywood and angle iron. She did not make a speech about this. She updated the cash flow projection for year 2, adjusted the roasting schedule to meet what the distribution commitments would require, and in the spring planted her next soybean crop with a level of attention to variety selection that she had never applied before because she understood now that variety mattered in a way it never had when the beans were going to a commodity elevator. The natural food buyer who had tasted her product cared about flavor and texture. Don Reardon had never had a reason to care about those things and never would. Earl Hutchins got the full account in January, 4 months after his phone call. Meg drove to the feed store on a Thursday morning and sat in the chair across from Earl's desk and told him what she had built and what it had cost and what the first year had returned. Earl listened the way he always listened, without interruption and without visible reaction until she was finished. Then he said, "I think you might be onto something." He was, as he would later admit to anyone who asked, understating it considerably. What he did not say at the time, because it was not the kind of thing Earl Hutchins said while a situation was still in motion, was that he thought he was looking at something that would outlast both of them, something rooted in that east barn and that 80-acre field that would still be running long after the county road outside his window had been repaved twice and the co-op down the intersection had changed hands again. He thought that. He kept it to himself. He said she might be onto something and meant it as the highest assessment he knew how to offer in the moment. Outside the feed store window, the county road was empty in the January cold. The Conrad Mills elevator was visible at the edge of the tree line, its roof pale against the low sky, running its business the same way it ran its business every January, accepting loads, sampling grain, applying policy. Don Reardon was in his office, doing what he had done for 22 years correctly and professionally, with no knowledge that in a barn 2 miles down the county road, something had been built in the past 4 months that would eventually carry the name of the farm and the county and the woman who had grown the beans he had correctly declined to purchase at full price into 11 states and onto the shelves of 90 retail locations and into the hands of people who had never heard of Cass County and never needed to understand that what they were eating was exactly what it said it was. That January, none of that had happened yet. The product was in 8 stores. The revenue was $47,000. The roaster was running in the East Barn, and Walt Greer was there every morning, and Patty Drummond was there most days, and the second drum roaster had not been purchased yet, and the distribution agreement with Heartland Natural did not exist yet, and the non-GMO certification was still 18 months away. But the 5 steps were no longer on a piece of paper. They were operational, and the woman who had written them down at a kitchen table in September, in the quiet of a farmhouse that had gone from one generation to the next, on the logic that some things are worth holding and some prices are worth refusing, was already thinking about year 2. The second year did not arrive gradually. It arrived the way most things arrived at the Callaway farm, as a set of concrete requirements that needed to be met in sequence. And the question was not whether Meg was ready, but whether the operation she had built was capable of scaling to meet what the market was now asking of it. By the summer of 1999, the 8 Kansas City accounts had stabilized into reliable reorder cycles. 3 of them had increased their case quantities. The Westport store, where Marcus Webb had eaten the first sample without hurrying, was reordering every 3 weeks. A buyer in Lawrence, Kansas had called after a trade publication mentioned Callaway Ridge in a brief item about emerging Midwest specialty food producers and had asked 2 questions: whether Meg could supply Lawrence consistently and whether she had an unsalted variety. Meg told him she could supply Lawrence and that she would have an unsalted option within 60 days. She developed it in 11 batches, which was less than half the time the original formula had taken, because she now understood the machine and the ingredient in a way she had not when she started. The second drum roaster came from the same equipment auction network where she had found the first one. She located it in August, a unit slightly newer than the original in better cosmetic condition, though mechanically equivalent, priced at $2,800. She arranged transport on a rented flatbed and had it installed in the East Barn over a long weekend, with Walt overseeing the mechanical integration. The 2 machines running in sequence doubled the production capacity without doubling the labor requirement, because Walt had developed a rhythm for operating the first roaster that transferred directly to the second, and because Patty had refined the packaging operation to a point where it could absorb additional output without additional personnel. It was October of 1999 when Meg drove to Columbia with a case of product and a price sheet and walked into the warehouse of Heartland Natural Distribution. The company distributed specialty and natural food products to retail accounts across Missouri, Kansas, and Iowa. It was not the largest distributor in the region, but it was the one with the deepest penetration in the independent natural food retail sector, which was exactly the sector where Callaway Ridge belonged. The account manager was a woman named Carol Fenn, who had been with Heartland for 12 years and who had the particular quality of a person who has seen enough products fail to have become genuinely interested only in the ones that will not. Carol ate the product in a warehouse meeting room with fluorescent lighting and a folding table. She ate it carefully, attending to what was actually in her mouth, giving the product the same attention she gave every decision she made in that role. Then she set the bag down and asked what the reorder rate was at the Kansas City accounts. Meg told her about the Westport store's 3-week cycle and the increases 3 accounts had made to their case quantities. Carol wrote something on her notepad. Then she said she would put Callaway Ridge in the fall catalog, subject to 2 conditions: consistent supply through the catalog period and non-GMO project certification within 18 months. Meg agreed to both. The certification condition was the harder one. The process was ongoing and the timeline was not entirely within her control. But she had submitted the application and the documentation was in order, and she understood that Carol Fenn was not setting the condition to create an obstacle, but to assess whether Meg was serious enough about the business to have already started the process. She had. The question answered itself. The Heartland Natural Catalog for winter 1999 listed Callaway Ridge dry-roasted soybeans in 2 varieties. It went to 34 natural food retail accounts across 3 states. In the first quarter of 2000, the reorder rate from those accounts was 78%. Carol Fenn called Meg in February to tell her that number was better than the distributor's average for new specialty food products by a margin she described as significant. Meg thanked her and asked whether the spring catalog would have additional placement opportunities. Carol said it would, and that she was already planning to include Callaway Ridge. It was during the preparation for the spring 2000 catalog that Carol called with a different kind of conversation. Heartland wanted to increase the Callaway Ridge volume commitment by 40%. In exchange, they were asking for exclusive distribution rights across all 3 states for a period of 2 years. It was a reasonable offer from a distributor that had taken a risk on an unproven brand and had been validated by the reorder numbers. It was also the kind of offer that could reshape the structure of the business in ways that were not fully visible at the moment of signing. Meg sat with the offer for 3 days. She talked to Walt not to get a decision, but to get a second perspective on the operational implications. Walt said that running the full volume through a single channel meant that any disruption in that channel became a disruption in the entire business. He said it the way he said most things without editorial comment, as a mechanical observation about a system. Meg talked to Patty, who said that refusing the volume increase might mean Heartland found another brand to fill the space, and that space, once filled, was difficult to reclaim. That was also true. On the 4th day, Meg called Carol Fenn and made a counter-proposal. Exclusive distribution in Missouri and Kansas, which were Heartland's strongest markets and where the existing account relationships were most developed. Iowa, she would retain the right to work independently. Carol was quiet for a moment that lasted long enough to mean she was genuinely thinking about it. Then she said that was acceptable. The Iowa carve-out seemed like a minor point at the time of the negotiation. It would not seem minor 3 years later when Meg established a direct account relationship with a regional grocery chain in Iowa that operated without a distributor in the middle, which meant the margin that would have gone to distribution stayed with the farm. That account became one of the most profitable in the Callaway Ridge portfolio. The 10 seconds of negotiation that preserved it cost nothing and returned considerably. The non-GMO project certification arrived in February of 2001 in an ordinary envelope that Patty brought in from the mailbox on a Thursday morning when Walt was running the second roaster and the barn smelled of warm soybeans and the particular dry heat that the machines produced in winter. Meg opened the envelope, read the document, and set it on the desk. Walt looked over. "What is it?" Patty asked. "Non-GMO certification," Meg said. Walt nodded. Patty nodded. No one raised their voice. No one moved to hug anyone. Meg put the certification in the file drawer where the regulatory documents were kept and said she needed to call Carol Fenn and that the labels would need to be reprinted with the certification seal. Then she asked Walt whether the rear bearing on the first roaster had been checked that week. He said it had. She said good and turned back to the production schedule. This was not the absence of satisfaction. It was a particular kind of satisfaction that does not require ceremony, the kind that comes from completing something you had committed to finishing before you fully knew whether you could. The certification meant accounts that had been waiting for the seal would now open. It meant the label now said everything it needed to say, and it meant the next phase had a foundation it had not had the week before. The new accounts came. 2 natural food chains that had made the certification a condition of placement added Callaway Ridge to their sets within 60 days. By the end of 2001, the brand was in 90 retail locations across 3 states and generating $310,000 in annual revenue. 6 full-time employees were now running shifts in the East Barn, which had been expanded twice since the original conversion. The facility had grown from the improvised but functional space Meg had built in the winter of 1998 to a structured operation with dedicated zones for roasting, seasoning, cooling, packaging, and storage. Meg was attending 2 trade shows a year by then, the Natural Products Expo Midwest in Chicago and a regional specialty food show in St. Louis. She drove to each one in her pickup truck. With a pop-up display, she had designed herself a cooler of samples and the specific willingness to talk to any buyer who stopped at the booth for as long as they wanted to talk. She had no promotional budget. She had a product that was consistent and a story that was verifiable and the patience to tell it without embellishment. At the Chicago show in 2001, The Callaway Ridge booth was a 10 by 10 space beside a Texas-based roasted nut brand that had spent what appeared to be a significant sum on their setup. LED displays, staff in matching shirts, sampling vessels that had clearly been designed by someone whose job title included the word brand. Buyers moved through the aisle in the efficient, directional way that trade show buyers move, and most of them kept moving past Meg's table. A woman named Karen Alderman stopped. She was a buyer for a 12-store natural food chain in Illinois, and she had the look of someone who had been walking trade show floors long enough to be done with being impressed by things that were designed to impress her. She looked at the booth, she looked at Meg, she said, "You're the owner." "And the grower," Meg said, "and the person who drove here this morning." Karen Alderman sat down in the folding chair across the table, and they talked for 45 minutes. Karen asked about the sourcing, the processing method, the certification, the reorder rates, the variety selection, the labor structure, the distribution footprint. Meg answered every question with the specificity of someone who had built the thing being asked about and did not need to consult notes. At the end of 45 minutes, Karen placed an opening order for all 12 stores. It was the largest single account acquisition Meg had made since signing with Heartland Natural. As Karen Alderman walked away, a young woman from the Texas Nut brand leaned over and asked Meg which agency she was using to pre-schedule buyer meetings. Meg said she wasn't using one. The young woman looked at her for a moment and then went back to her station, and no one from that booth said anything further. The cumulative revenue from Callaway Ridge crossed $1 million sometime in the early months of 2002. The date was not known precisely because Meg was not tracking it. She was tracking inventory turns and the reorder rate from the Iowa accounts and whether the production schedule for the spring run was calibrated correctly against the volume commitments she had made to Heartland for the second quarter. The $1 million number appeared in the year-end summary that her accountant Bob Finley called to deliver in March, using the kind of careful voice that men use when they believe they are delivering news that should alter the room. Meg thanked him, asked him to make sure the quarterly estimate was updated for the new Iowa account, and ended the call. Patty was standing nearby and asked what the call was about. Meg told her. Patty said that call for coffee. Meg said yes, but Walt needed to check the roasting schedule first because there were 3 additional batches that week from the Iowa order. Walt went to the barn, Patty made the coffee, Meg opened the production log and began working through the schedule. The $1 million was a number that described something that had already happened. The number that mattered was whether the next season's crop would support the commitments she had made to the people who were now depending on the Callaway Ridge supply chain. That was the number she was tracking. Tom Callaway came to visit the farm in the summer of 2003 with his wife and Annie, who was now 20 years old and studying marketing at the University of Missouri. Tom had not been back since the early years of the operation, when it was still small enough that the scale of what Meg had built was not yet fully legible. He walked through the facility with the measured quietness of a man recalibrating what he thought he understood about a situation. He stood in the production area and watched the roasters run. He looked at the packaging line where Patty was overseeing 2 workers moving through a sequence that had been refined over 4 years to the point of mechanical fluency. He looked at the stacked cases of finished product waiting for the distributor pickup. He looked at the label on the nearest case, the ink drawing of the soybean plant that his daughter had sent by fax when she was 16 years old, not knowing it would become the face of something. He said quietly and without looking at Meg directly, "Dad would have liked this." Meg said, "I know." Tom looked at the label for another moment. "Annie knows her drawing is still on there. It's not changing," Meg said. Tom nodded. He did not say anything else about the land or about selling anything or about the year he had sat at the kitchen table and described the farm as a problem to be simplified. Some reckonings happen in silence over time, in the presence of evidence that speaks for itself. Tom Calloway's reckoning happened in a converted barn in Cass County on a Tuesday afternoon in the summer of 2003, and it was complete by the time he walked back to his car. Don Reardon retired from Conrad Mills in June of 2004 after 30 years of managing the elevator. He had run the operation the right way for 3 decades, and that had always been true of him. Meg sent him a jar of roasted soybeans when she heard he was retiring. She included a handwritten note that said she had found a use for the beans he had sent back. She did not write anything else because nothing else needed to be said. Don received the bomb and the note at home on a Thursday afternoon about 2 weeks after his last day at the elevator. He read the note twice. He opened the car and ate some of the soybeans standing at his kitchen counter, because that is how men of his generation eat things they are sampling, standing up without a plate. They were good, better than good. There was something in the flavor that he could not have described technically, but that registered as the particular character of a specific ingredient treated with specific care, not the generic product of a process applied to undifferentiated commodity grain. He thought about the probe sample he had taken from the Peterbilt in September of 1998. He thought about the woman standing beside the truck doing the math in 45 seconds, thanking him and telling the driver to take it back. He had seen a commodity grower who had brought in a load with a quality problem. He had applied the appropriate policy. He had not been wrong about the grain, but he had been wrong about what he was looking at. He sent a card back. He asked where he could buy more. Meg wrote back in the same handwriting on a note, the same size as the first one, and told him the Peculiar Grocery carried Callaway Ridge on the specialty food shelf, second row from the top on the right side. Don drove to Peculiar on a Saturday morning. He found the shelf. He found the second row right side. The bag was facing out with the ink drawing of the soybean plant visible through the front panel, the same clean lines, the 3 leaves and 2 pods. He put 2 bags in his cart. At the register, the young woman working the checkout said that Callaway Ridge was the best-selling product in the specialty food section and that a lot of people came in specifically for it. Don said that he knew the person who made it. The cashier said that Mrs. Callaway was something of a local figure. Don paid for the bags and walked to his car. He sat for a while before starting the engine. He thought about 30 years of running the elevator. He thought about 10,000 loads sampled and graded and accepted or discounted or turned away. He thought about the specific Tuesday morning in September and the specific result on the probe and the specific woman who had done 45 seconds of math and decided to go home. He had not been wrong, he knew that. But the knowledge of not being wrong and the knowledge of what had happened because of that morning were 2 separate things. And sitting in the parking lot of the Peculiar Grocery with 2 bags of Callaway Ridge soybeans on the passenger seat, both of those things were true at the same time, and he held them both without needing to resolve the tension between them. That was the thing about 30 years in the grain business. It taught you that a thing could be correctly handled and still be the beginning of something you did not anticipate. He drove home and ate most of 1 bag before he arrived. Earl Hutchins had closed his feed store in the spring of 2001 after 33 years at the intersection of routes B and 7. He was 71 and there was no one to pass the business to, and the building needed more work than made sense at his age. He sold the building to a man who converted it into a farm supply storage facility and retired to his property 4 miles outside of town, where he kept a vegetable garden and read more than he had been able to read when the store was running. He still drove past the intersection sometimes. He saw the Conrad Mills elevator the way he had always seen it, as a fixed point in the landscape of the county, as permanent seeming as the water tower and the old co-op building. And he thought when he drove past about the Tuesday morning, he had watched the Peterbilt pull out with a full grain bed and had stood at his window for a long time trying to read what he was seeing. He had told Meg when she described the plan to him in January of 1999 that he thought she might be onto something. He had known at the time that he was understating it. He had not known by how much. In the years after he closed the store, he told the story to people who asked about Callaway Ridge, which was a brand that had become well known enough in the county that people asked about its origins, the way they asked about anything that had grown from local ground into something larger. He told the story of the Tuesday morning and the probe sample and the load that came back and the winter in the barn and the 8 phone calls in Kansas City, and he always ended it the same way. He said she didn't need the elevator, she just didn't know it yet. Then he would stop because he had been saying it that way for a while, and it had never felt entirely right. And one afternoon, sitting in his garden in the particular quiet of a summer day, when there is no wind and the county sounds like itself, he revised it for the last time. He said she knew it. She just needed Don Reardon to make it obvious. That version he kept. Meg Callaway still farms the 200 acres in Cass County. The Callaway Ridge brand is in 11 states. The facility attached to the East Barn is 4,200 square feet. There are 6 full-time employees and 2 part-time workers added during the peak season. The 80 acres where the rejected load came from in September of 1998 still produce soybeans every year, and those soybeans still go into the drum roasters that Walt Greer helped install in December of 1998, and that Dale wired for $180 at family rate. Walt still comes in some mornings, not because he has to, but because the barn is a place he understands and the work is work he respects. And at 67 when he started, and past 70 now, a man who has spent 40 years in productive rhythm with machinery does not give that rhythm up easily if he does not have to. His son runs the Greer farm now. Walt runs the morning shift at Callaway Ridge when the schedule calls for it, and when it does not, he is usually there anyway checking something. Patty Drummond's children are grown. She still runs the packaging operation. She has trained 3 people in the sequence she developed in 1999. The one she rearranged without asking, and that Meg had told her to announce in advance next time, and all 3 of them worked the line the way she taught them, with the efficiency of people who learn the right way from someone who had already found it by working it out herself. Annie Callaway graduated from the University of Missouri and works in marketing in St. Louis, not far from where her father Tom spent his career. She has a framed print of the original soybean plant illustration on the wall of her apartment. It is a reproduction because the original is in Meg's desk drawer under a stack of invoices, and the original is not going anywhere. The newest combine has a cylinder speed monitor with a real-time alert system. Meg calibrated it at the start of each of the last several harvests because the problem that produced the 12% cracked sample in September of 1998 was a technical problem with a technical solution, and she had applied the solution the following season and had not repeated the error. She did not need the reminder that the monitor provided. She said it anyway because a system worth building is worth maintaining, and because the 80 acres that produced the rejected load deserve the same attention now that they did, then which is the full attention of someone who understands exactly what they are growing and why it matters and what it can become in the right hands. She did not set out to build a brand. She set out to not give $5,400 to an elevator that was going to extract more value from her grain than that before it left the county. The brand was what happened when she followed that decision to its logical conclusion with a food science degree and a rented flatbed and 23 batches of test data and a fax drawing from a 16-year-old girl who thought she was just drawing a plant. And on the specialty food shelf in the Peculiar Grocery's second row, From the top right side, the bag faces out the way it has faced out for years with the ink drawing on the front and the words Cass County, Missouri beneath it. Some people buy it because they know the story. Most people buy it because they tasted it once and it was exactly what it said. It was grown by the person whose name is on the label on the ground, where it has always been grown in the county, where the decision was made that made everything else possible. That is usually enough. For most things that last, it is exactly enough.